The world we live in today moves fast. We work all day, stare at screens, and chase deadlines. When it's time to relax, we go to coffee shops or bars. We play music, scroll through our phones, and look forward to happy hour like it's a reward for surviving the day. But what if we go back to a time when there were no phones, no lights, and no city bars, just desert winds, Nile floods, and the hum of ancient life? Back to ancient Egypt, which was known for its gods, gold, and pyramids. But here's something most people miss. The Egyptians had their version of happy hour. After working hard in the sun, they didn't just go home. They gathered together in small courtyards, sat down with others, and shared a thick, sweet beer. So, here's the big question. What did the ancient Egyptians do to relax after work? What kind of beer did they drink? And why was it so important to them? To understand this, we have to look beyond the pyramids and into everyday life. Because beer was more than simply a drink in ancient Egypt. It was a way of life. People used it to celebrate, get paid, and even connect with their gods. So, let's start from the beginning. How was the beer made? Who brewed it? And what did a typical beer house look like? Brewing beer the ancient way. When you think of beer today, you probably imagine shiny metal tanks, taps, and glass bottles. But around the time of the Old Kingdom of Egypt, the beer looked and tasted completely different. To a modern-day beer drinker, an Egyptian brew would taste more like a fruit drink than a traditional beer. It wasn't brewed in huge factories or poured from bottles. It all started with bread. Yes, bread. Egyptians used two types of grains, emmer wheat and barley, which grew easily along the banks of the Nile. Loaves of bread were made with these grains and then baked until half-cooked. These half-cooked loaves were then soaked in water and placed in heated jars to ferment. Yeast was also added to increase the fermentation process. Once the fermentation began, the mixture would bubble and thicken. Then the beer was strained after a few days. They strained it out using a sieve into a vat to remove the larger chunks, and what remained after straining was a thick, porridge-like brew. It wasn't smooth like today's beer. It was like a barley smoothie full of grainy bits, but for the Egyptians, it was perfect. They were completely unaware of the use of hops or the carbonation process. This brew wasn't meant to be cold or clear. It was meant to fill the belly, provide energy, and refresh those working all day in the fields. The ancient Egyptians used to flavor their beer with date juice or honey because the straining method they used to produce beer would not give much flavor. So they used to add them to enhance the taste and alcohol content of beer. What's more fascinating is that the beer was produced at all levels of society. It was made in homes for family gatherings, in temples as offerings to gods, and in big production centers for festivals. No matter where you were in the Old Kingdom, the beer was everywhere. And this wasn't a side dish, it was the main course. It was just as necessary as the bread. You might have heard about the Egyptian phrase, bread and beer. It showcases the importance of beer in their everyday life. It was said as often as we say food and water today. Who made the beer? In ancient Egypt, beer was not produced by skilled professionals in labs or factories. It was an art that passed down through generations. This art was frequently practiced in homes, temples, and workshops. Here's something most people don't know. Women were the first brewers. Shocked to hear that? But it's a fact. Women were the actual main brewers in ancient Egypt. Both brewing and baking were activities undertaken by women, and the numerous statuettes found in the tombs show women grinding grain in mills or sifting the resulting flour, Egyptologist Helen Strudwick writes. Women were the first to brew beer in homes, and later it became a state-funded industry governed by men. Brewing was strongly connected with both home life and religious traditions. Some women also became temple brewers, making beer for rituals, festivals, and offerings to gods. In other words, we can say that these early brewers were the heartbeat of Egyptian food culture. The common name for beer was Heket or Tinamou, but there was also unique names for different types of beer. Beer was classified based on its alcoholic strength and flavor. Typical beer contained 3 to 4% alcohol, whereas the beer used in rituals and festivals contained more alcohol and was considered of greater quality. But brewing was not limited to the homes. There were also state-run breweries in major towns and temple complexes which used to make beer at massive scale. Archaeologists have found breweries at sites like Abydos where 500-year-old clay vat rows have been discovered, which indicate industrial-scale manufacturing. This brewery could make up to 5,900 gallons of beer at a time. But there's one question that comes to mind. What was the purpose of such massive production? The answer is to serve enormous workforces and supply for rituals, festivals, and state events. This is where the men came in. They helped in transporting grains, firing kilns, and managing massive fermentation jars. But the origin of the art remained with women, which they held with pride. This all shows us the importance of beer in ancient Egypt, whether it was a tiny home brew for a family gathering or a huge state batch for a royal event. Beer production in ancient Egypt was a collaborative effort. Inside a beer house. So, what did an Egyptian beer house look like? Forget the bar stools, menus, and music. They were simple, open spaces, sometimes courtyards, sometimes modest mud brick rooms where people gathered to rest, eat, and drink. There were big clay jars lined up against the wall. Each jar was filled with thick, freshly brewed beer. These jars or vessels held significant importance in the fermenting process. Their interior was porous, which provided a suitable surface for the yeast culture to grow. They were also colder to touch than the surrounding temperature, which was a clear advantage to brewing in hot, arid areas. When it came to drinking the beer, there weren't any cups or mugs. Instead, people drank from the jar using long, thin reed straws to avoid swallowing the grainy pieces at the bottom. Some say these straws were made from clay with holes or a filter at the end to remove some of the sediment. It wasn't just about getting drunk, it was about being together. Workers would meet in these courtyards after a long day of farming or building to relax and talk. It was like a social space in the community. Beer houses were not just for the poor or working class. Rich Egyptians had their own private versions where they served guests with beer during feasts and festivities. It's evident now that the beer was not only served in homes, it was the main part of rituals, festivals, and celebrations. We can say that these beer houses were the first pubs, simple and communal. And for Egyptians, the act of gathering to drink was not just a tradition, it was a part of life, part of joy, and part of survival. It was like a happy hour. More than a drink. For ancient Egyptians, beer was not only a drink to cool off after a long day of labor, it was something deeper. It was associated with their culture, beliefs, and even their gods. In temples, it was used for religious ceremonies. In festivals, it was poured out in praise of divinities. It was considered a way to connect with gods. There's a powerful myth that shows how beer influenced the beliefs of Egyptians, the story of Hathor. In this story, the goddess Hathor was sent to punish people for their disobedience, but her wrath got out of control. She was so thirsty for blood that the other gods thought if she persisted like this, there'd be no humans left. Then a large quantity of beer was dyed red to look like blood and was dumped around the land to let her drink it. She drank so much and then passed out. She woke again as Hathor, the gentle and kind friend of the community. The Tek festival in Egypt commemorated this event. This story shows us how beer was seen as powerful, joyful, and even capable of saving humans. Beer was also frequently mentioned in medical textbooks. Over 100 recipes for remedies incorporated beer. Even when beer was not listed as an ingredient, a patient was advised to take the prescription with a cup of beer. This was supposed to gladden the heart of the patient. Imagine if doctors gave such prescriptions today. The patient will be surprised, but it was done in the Old Kingdom. Beer was also thought to baffle the bad spirits who were blamed for a variety of diseases. Precise recipes for these brews were never recorded, but the procedure is quite obvious from the writings and tiny models of brewers discovered in tombs. Other than regular meals and festivals, beer was also a popular drink at funerals. Funerals were a celebration of the deceased's life as well as a send-off for the soul on its journey to the afterlife. Once the ceremony of the funeral was completed, relatives and guests would gather under a tent for a picnic banquet at which the deceased's favorite foods would be served along with beer. The beer served at funerals would have higher alcohol content than a regular one. Just as beer was offered to the soul of the deceased, it was regarded as the best offering to the gods. Temples made their own beer, which was offered to the god's statue in the inner sanctum to cheer his or her heart. Food and drink were placed in front of the statue, which contained the spirits. The nutrients were then absorbed supernaturally. The meal would then be taken away and distributed to the temple staff. It's said that Osiris, the god of the afterlife, has given these people the knowledge of beer. The people in return expressed their gratitude by offering the product of that knowledge, beer, the drink of the gods. Beer is payment. Men, women, and children all drank beer as it was regarded as a source of nutrition rather than an intoxicant. Beer was so important that it was frequently used as compensation for labor. It was part of daily food rations for each worker building the pyramids of Giza. This beer was less strong than the traditional one. Each worker would be given 4 liters of beer along with a loaf of bread every day. In ancient Egypt, there are many records of people being paid with beer. You may wonder why anyone would pay workers in beer as it does not produce efficiency. However, in ancient times, beer was thicker and considered a meal substitute. Beer flowed through every part of ancient Egypt, quietly holding their world together. And in every sip, there was more than just barley. There was tradition, connection, and the joy of a simple pause. Clay jars, cold pours, and ancient cheers. This was Egypt's happy hour. Like this dive into the life of ancient Egyptians? Share your thoughts in the comments, hit subscribe, and join us for the next story.